Okay, so we're looking at the respiratory system today, and then we're going to look at the cardiorespiratory system as well. So, respiratory system is very related to the cardiovascular system. Like, our cardiorespiratory system is literally what powers our entire body. We're bringing in oxygen and delivering that oxygen. So, yesterday we talked about how we're going to kind of deliver everything around, but today we're going to talk about how to actually extract that oxygen from the atmosphere. So our overview of things, right, when we're looking at like our processes, we are going to look a little bit at the structure, all the cavities that kind of come in. We're mostly going to spend our time talking about the lungs and our bronchi and our pleurae. Then we'll look at like respiration, inhalation versus exhalation. So that's talking about the process of ventilation. We'll look a little bit about like gas exchange and transportation. And then we're probably not going to go over too much of this. Disorders that we'll go over, we'll probably mention a little bit about like COPD, but for the most part, like we're going to kind of keep it brief there. And yeah, actually that's about it for that. Then what we'll do is we'll go into our second PowerPoint where we will dive straight into putting the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system together. So you're going to see some repeat stuff in that PowerPoint. For sure, but you'll also get a lot more from the perspective of like, hey, if we're talking about exercise, here's what's going to happen. Which MEMLers is great, but MEMLers doesn't really cover too much when it comes to like understanding the exercise adaptations because that's not really their job, right? So before I get into respiration here, let's go ahead and take Alan over to the YouTubes. Crash course. Oh, cool. There's an ad paid for by the Donald Trump. Oh, very nice. Awesome. That's really exciting. And we'll go ahead and hit this button right here. All right. Oh, my mute. All right. All right, here we go.
Introduce you to one of the bravest pioneers in the history of life on planet Earth. An organism that blazed the trail for every single vertebrate that lives on land today and many that don't. It's one of your most important ancestors. Meat? Well, it doesn't have a name. And we don't exactly know what it looked like either. But we do know that about 380 million years ago, this fishy-looking thing with big fleshy fins achieved one of the animal kingdom's greatest milestones. Breathing air. Sounds simple enough, but believe me, it wasn't. Because for billions of years before this fishy ancestor came around, basically all of life evolved in water. From the very beginning, the earliest, simplest forms of life, like bacteria, extracted oxygen they needed right from the water through their membranes. And they did it through simple diffusion, when a material automatically flows from where it is concentrated to where it is less concentrated, so it balances out. Diffusion works really well, and it requires zero effort, but it wasn't going to cut it in the big leagues. Anything larger than a small worm is simply too big and needs too much oxygen for diffusion to work. So in order to get bigger, early life forms needed a circulatory system that could move bulk amounts of oxygen around faster inside their bodies, and a respiratory system to bring more oxygen in contact with their wet membranes. So their respiratory surfaces moved from their outer surfaces to the insides of their bodies. First there were gills, but gills of course still only work inside of water. And a little more than 380 million years ago, this was starting to lose some of its charm. Earth was getting warmer, the seas were getting shallower, and much of the planet's surface water had lower concentrations of oxygen than it used to. Finally, a humble little lobe-finned fish got fed up, swam up to the water's surface, and started breathing air. It could do this because it had evolved a fancy new interface to move gases between the air and its cell membranes. I'm talking about lungs. Wet lungs. With an efficient new way to take in nearly limitless amounts of oxygen from air, animals were eventually able to get bigger and more diverse over the ages, and now all of us lung-having vertebrates share that common ancestor. For lots of animals, including humans, those lungs come with a bunch of other equipment like protective ribs, a stiff trachea, and in mammals, a strong diaphragm. And together, they form your respiratory system, which happens to be best friends and business partners with your circulatory system. It's only by working together and using both the bulk flow and simple diffusion of oxygen that they can make possible the process of cellular respiration. In other words, life itself. So a lot of improvements have been made to it over the eons, but the respiratory system that you are using right now is your inheritance from that ancient, ambitious fish, leader of one of the most important anatomical revolutions of the past 500 million years. Pretend for a minute that you can't breathe. Like you just don't have lungs anymore. You are some bizarre evolutionary oddity, a huge human-shaped organism that doesn't have a respiratory system. Instead, you get all of your oxygen the way that your oldest, smallest evolutionary ancestors did, by simple diffusion, or at least you try to get all your oxygen that way. How would it work? Well, poorly. And that's partly because one of the keys to efficient diffusion of any material is distance. If you want a molecule to diffuse across a space quickly, you want it to be as close to its destination as possible with the fewest obstacles in the way. But for a single molecule of oxygen to diffuse from the air through, say, your scalp and then go to a neuron deep inside your brain, it would have to move through your skin and then your skull and then your connective tissue and all sorts of things. It would eventually get there, like maybe a month later, but at that point, the cell that needed the oxygen in the first place would have, suffocated to death. Basically, obtaining oxygen through diffusion alone is like wanting to go to a party at your friend's place across town and then walking 20 miles to get there. You could do it, but it would take forever, and by the time you arrived, you'd be all haggard and the party would be over. So diffusion alone isn't enough to get the job done. We do use it, but only when a whole bunch of the materials we need are right up against the tissues that can absorb them. So you know what else we need? Bulk flow. Bulk flow is like public transportation. It moves large numbers of molecules quickly. Rather than walk the whole way across town, you can hop on a bus with a bunch of other people and get there in 20 minutes. Every time you take a deep breath, you bring in about 100 quintillion oxygen molecules into your lungs all at once. They're on a bulk flow bus ride. And once those oxygen molecules filter down into the cells in your lungs, they're suddenly very close to the blood they're trying to reach. All they have to do is diffuse across 4 layers of cell membranes to get from the lung cell into the blood. It's like hopping off the bus and then walking a half a block to your friend's apartment. That's why your respiratory system is the way it is. It's set up to take full advantage of both bulk flow and simple diffusion. The bulk flow part of things is handled by some of your system's biggest and most obvious moving parts, starting with your lungs, which basically operate like a pump or a bellows. They don't have any contractible muscle tissue because they need to be able to expand, so they require outside help in order to move. Enter the diaphragm, a big, thin set of muscles that separates your thorax from your abdomen. When your lungs empty, your diaphragm relaxes and looks kind of like an arc pushing up to squish your lungs. You also have the weight of your rib cage pushing on your lungs from the top and sides, and together these forces decrease the volume of your lungs. When you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts, pulling itself flat, and your external intercostal muscles between your ribs contract. They lift the ribs up and out, causing the chest cavity to expand. This makes the pressure inside your lungs lower than the air outside your body, and since fluids like gases move from areas of high pressure to low pressure, the lungs fill up with outside air. Then the diaphragm relaxes again, and the weight of the ribs settles in, and the pressure inside the lungs becomes higher than the outside air, and the air rushes out. And that, my friends, is breathing 101. Now, your respiratory system contains a lot of parts besides your lungs, some prominently displayed on your face, others hidden deep within your chest. And functionally, all of these organs fall into one of 2 physiological zones. The upper parts that funnel the air in make up what's known as the conducting zone, and it starts with this thing. Your nose is supported by bone and cartilage and the bristly hairs and mucus inside it that help filter out dust and other particles. So it, along with your sinuses, performs another important function. It warms and moistens incoming air so it doesn't dry out those sensitive lung cells that must remain wet. Remember, moisture is key. We evolved from organisms that lived in water, so just like with our aquatic bacterial ancestors, we need water for oxygen to dissolve into before it can diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer membrane of our cells. Now, if you've ever choked on a poorly timed sip of water, you've noticed that you breathe through the same tube that you also move foods and liquids through. This is yet another leftover from those first fish lungs, which evolved as a branch off the esophagus. Looking back, it was not ideal, but we are stuck with it. So the stuff that you swallow soon encounters the epiglottis, a little trapdoor of tissue which covers the larynx and directs bites of sandwich and sips of cola towards your esophagus and keeps them out of your lungs. And you'll notice that the esophagus, which heads to your stomach, is nice and flexible, while your trachea, or windpipe, is rigid and has prominent rings. That's because your trachea is basically built like a vacuum hose. Since the lungs create negative pressure with every breath, the trachea needs those rings to keep it open. If it were soft and floppy, it would collapse every time the pressure dropped and you wouldn't be able to breathe. From there, the trachea splits in 2, forming the right and left main bronchi. You can imagine these inner lung parts as sort of an upside-down tree. Now we are in the lung tissue and have entered what we call the respiratory zone. This is where the actual gas exchange occurs, and everything you find here has a form to suit that function. So the smaller branches of the upside-down tree are bronchioles, which taper down into progressively narrower tubes until they empty into the alveolar ducts, and then dead end into tiny alveolar sacs, where the bulk of the gas exchange finally occurs. Because that's where each sac contains a cluster of alveoli. these tiny cavities lined with super thin wet membranes made of simple squamous epithelium tissue. It's here that oxygen molecules dissolve in the wet mucus, diffuse across the epithelial cells, and then cross the single layer of endothelial cells lining the capillaries to enter the bloodstream. And of course, it's also where carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood and then follows the same route back up to the nose and mouth where it's exhaled. So it's your alveoli where diffusion meets bulk flow, because while you're picking up oxygen and dispensing with CO2 one molecule at a time, you're doing it in enormous quantities at any given second. Both of your lungs contain about 700 million alveoli, which together provide an amazing 75 square meters of moist membrane surface area. So the principles that make respiration possible are relatively simple: diffusion and bulk flow. And so are the mechanisms in your body that use them. It just took us about 400 million years to figure out how to make it all work. But today you learned how it does work, including the mechanics of both simple diffusion and bulk flow, and physiology of breathing, and the anatomy of the conducting zone and the respiratory zone of your respiratory system. Thank you to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for themselves and for everyone in the world for free with their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale. The script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed and edited by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor was Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay. Okay. So it's kind of a fun one, right? The lungfish, which are still around, but yeah, we have no idea what the original ones look like. So we are going to be talking about the respiratory system in general. So the respiratory system, right, is the system of the body responsible for proper cellular functioning, which sounds kind of surprising. Like when you hear it, it doesn't sound like exactly what you usually think of when you think of your lungs. Like you're not really like thinking about like cellular functioning, but that's literally their main job. Every cell in your body needs oxygen in order to survive. And so this is the system that's responsible for pulling that oxygen out of the air. I mean, we can't really get it from our nutrients, like our digestive system breaks down food that have oxygen in them. So why can't we get it that way? Well, the levels are just simply too low, and they're all arranged in the form of like monosaccharides and things like that. So we have to have our respiratory system to bring in pure oxygen, but we also need it to be able to filter out all those other things that we don't bring in. So for instance, earlier we talked about bringing in, or when we talked about the digestive system, we have to bring in nitrogen that way. That's how we get our amino acids to build new proteins. Well, what's funny is there's more nitrogen in the air than there is oxygen. Most of what you breathe in every breath is nitrogen, not O2. So like, why don't we just get our nitrogen that way? Well, again, like it's not in the shape that we need it to be in. It's not in the form of amino acids, so we can't really use it that way. So we have these two specialized kind of systems here. And this is, like I said, very much responsible for proper cellular functioning, just like our digestive system is also going to power our body as well. This is the system of the body responsible for extracting oxygen from the environment to be utilized by the body's cells, right? And that's really what we're talking about there. So when we're talking about the respiratory system, we are talking about respiration, right? And so respiration, we're going to define that as the process of obtaining oxygen from the environment and delivering it to cells, right? So this is how we are kind of extracting the proper gas. Your lungs are almost like they're a filter, right? Like they filter in, allow oxygen to get into our system, but like not other things. Like we're not bringing in too many other dangerous gases, or gases not even dangerous, just gases we don't need. And so that's really the process. Like respiration is going to refer to ventilation, right? Ventilation is bringing things in. So there's 4 primary like phases to respiration, right? You've got pulmonary ventilation, which is the process of like driving bulk flow into your lungs. there's an external gas exchange, which this is actually where, Raul, this is the first time you're going to hear me use the human donut analogy. And it doesn't apply perfectly to our lungs, but, well, I mean, it still kind of does. So the thing about your lungs is, yes, they're inside your chest, but technically they're not inside your body. Because like, if you think about it, it's this empty sac that kind of goes in and like expands. And then what happens is you've got blood vessels that come right up to the wall, which are on the inside of your body. And oxygen is able to diffuse through that wall. Now that oxygen is inside your body. If we think of it that way, it's inside, it's systemic, it's in your actual system. If we think of like your blood traveling to all of your organs, that's the inside environment. But at your lungs, that is actually an exchange between the outside environment of like the room that you're standing in right now, and the the inner part of your body, which is your blood, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why we actually refer to this as external gas exchange, because it is an exchange between the external environment. And then what will happen is you're going to experience gas transport in the blood. So blood's going to take, all those oxygen molecules to wherever they need to go. And then you're going to experience an internal gas exchange where your blood is going to drop off those oxygen molecules to whatever tissue is going to need that oxygen, right? So that's kind of the 4 phases here. So I'll gotta go ahead and break each of these down here. So respiration, when we're referring to respiration, we're not just talking about breathing in and breathing out. We're talking about the exchange of oxygen, and it's happening in 4 phases, right? So respiration is going to consist of pulmonary ventilation, which is going to be the process of driving massive amounts of gas into the lungs, right? Then we're also going to see an external gas exchange. You know what, actually what I should do, hold on. We'll make this just like the PowerPoint. And numbers. All right, external gas exchange is step 2, right? And that is going to be the process of driving oxygen into red blood cells while driving CO2, carbon dioxide. Actually, you know what? And just because while I'm doing it, O2. So external gas exchange is the process of driving oxygen into the red blood cells while driving carbon dioxide out of red blood cells into the lungs, right? And so now, like, we're exchanging those nutrients, right? I'm going to take CO2 push it out of my body. I'm going to bring O2 into my body. Then what's going to happen is we're going to experience gas transport in the blood, which is going to be red blood cells will transport oxygen to body tissues, right? And then we are going to see an internal gas exchange. And that is going to be exactly the opposite of what we saw just a second ago, right? This is going to be the process of driving oxygen out of red blood cells into body tissues, and CO2, or carbon dioxide, out of body tissues into red blood cells. And there we go. That's the entire process of respiration, right? So it's a series of 4 main events here. And that's exactly what's happening on a cellular level as well. Like, we're about to move into talking about metabolism over the next few days. And when we're talking about metabolism, we're talking about how a body cell is going to bring in O2 and spit out CO2. Meanwhile, your red blood cells are going to pick that up from that tissue, drive it to your lungs. You are a large version of like a cell bringing in and getting rid of oxygen. So this is kind of what we're seeing here in terms of respiration, right? Like if we look at it, you've got an external gas, you have an internal gas exchange, and you have an external gas exchange here, right? And then this is also internal exchange. It's just happening in the two different areas, right? And so in the lungs, right, you are picking up oxygen as air comes in, and then that oxygenated blood is going to go over to the heart, and it's going to get pumped to wherever it's going. It's going to deliver that oxygen to your body's tissues. Your body's tissues will trade that oxygen for some CO2 instead, and so then that CO2 is going to drive into that blood cell, which will then have to get back to the heart, where it will get pumped over to the lungs, and it will drop off all of that CO2 and pick up more oxygen, and the process will repeat itself over and over and over and over and over again. So those are kind of what we're looking at in terms of respiration there. Now, that's all really cool, but we have to have a lot of really cool specialized structures within our respiratory system. And so we got to kind of look, again, if form follows function, if function follows form, we got to make sure that like we have the right shaped tools in order to be able to drive in massive, massive, massive amounts of oxygen molecules. And so luckily we have these big squishy sacs inside of our chest that expand and contract and drive massive amounts of air in. And so if we're looking at it, right, we're going to have two primary components here, which are going to be your respiratory pump and your respiratory passageways, which this PowerPoint's not going to do a great job of breaking down. So I'm going to wait until we get to the NASM slides to get into that. But the pump is basically all the structures that allow the lungs to contract and expand. And the passageways are what we're seeing here. Things like your nasal cavities, your pharynx and larynx, your trachea, and then your bronchi, which are like these branching tubes that house all these really cool little things called alveoli. So this is actually what we see when we look at our respiratory system, right? You can see we can drive air in through our nose, we can drive air in through our mouth, and eventually they'll just meet up in this common tube called your trachea here. And your trachea is this cartilaginous kind of hollow tube that makes it really easy for oxygen to travel down. And what that does is that's going to branch into what are called your pulmonary bronchi, which bronchi is just the plural version of plural version, no pun intended, you'll get that joke in a minute, the plural version of like two bronchus tubes. But your bronchi are basically these big branches right here. And then what happens is it branches into really, 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 really small versions called your bronchioles, which are all these really itty bitty branches that kind of branch out from here. Bronchiole, which might kind of sound a little bit similar to like when we were talking about arteries and arterioles, or veins and venules, right? These are basically miniature branches that extend from your primary bronchi here. So these little tiny like fingers, what you'll notice is if you go in, zoom in even further, and let me see if I can find a picture here. Yeah, you'll notice they end in these little popcorn shaped sacs called alveoli. And so these alveoli are these sacs that are just covered head to toe in capillary beds. And that right there is where oxygen is literally moving through the wall and diffusing straight into our blood, or maybe CO2 is diffusing from our blood into that like external environment there so that we can exhale it all. So kind of going back here and then moving pretty quickly through some of this. Our structures that we've got, right, you are going to see there's sort of our main primary structures. You're going to have your nasal cavities. You're going to have things like your sinuses. I told a horrifying story about sinuses yesterday. You're going to see your pharynx. And your pharynx is going to carry air into the respiratory tract and your food into your digestive system. So it's this sort of like divider. And it's got this really cool little structure at the top of it called your glottis and your epiglottis. This is actually at your larynx. And what that is it's basically like the tube for bringing in oxygen is basically always open. It's like a little tube that sits like this. and then there's a little flap that sits on it like that. And so it would be sitting here like this. And then what happens is like air is always able to come in, but the second you like swallow food, it just goes like this. It literally goes boop, and that is about as fast as it contracts, and that sends food into your stomach. If you have ever like been eating and you're like, and you said like, oh, it went down the wrong pipe, that is an accurate depiction, because like literally you just trapped food that was trying to go into your lungs, and so then your lungs were like, holy crap, and so they, you know, caused your diaphragm to contract and you start coughing, and that hopefully pushes that food out of there. And here's where you can actually see all that, right? There's the epiglottis right there. There's a little bone that kind of keeps the whole thing, like has a nice structure and allows that flap to do its job. But here's all the cartilage that allows, you know, your neck to move around while still being strong enough to not close, right? We definitely don't want to like pinch down this airway and keep air or other nutrients from being able to get into the rest of our body. And so luckily, you know, this structure is nice and solid and allows that to happen. And then this is what your vocal cords look like. Not really a huge part of like what we talk about, but it is kind of fun. Basically, the way these like vibrate here is what determines your tone. So when they, and actually, if you ever want to like see this happen in action, it is kind of cool. If you ever look up a YouTube video of like what different vocal sounds sound like when they're really close together and they vibrate super, super fast, that's a high pitch sound. And then you'll notice like when it's really like low pitch, there's like wah, 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 wah. But you can look up videos of people like making like different sounds and stuff. Like people will sing and they'll have a camera down their throat, which to me seems insane, but they can do it. I guess they're just tougher than me. But yeah, it's kind of fun looking. Now you've also got your trachea. Your trachea is also going to conduct air in this. This is going to have like the actual cartilage there, right? Like this is the very solid tube that, you know, presents or prevents things from being able to like close down. And so if you've ever seen like, you know, sometimes you'll see it in movies and stuff. I feel like I haven't seen this in movie or TV in years, but for like, I remember in the 90s, it was like in every cartoon where someone would start choking and then somebody like, we got to do an emergency tracheotomy. And they're like, give me a pen. And they would like take the tube of a pen and they'd like shove it through someone's throat here because like there was food blocking up here. So they couldn't like breathe anymore. So they'd let them breathe through like a tube here. That was like a staple in like movies and TV for like a few years. And it was like, they got like played out. Now I haven't seen it on TV in years. It's like horrifying. It's like, oh God. Like, but that's what you're seeing in like a tracheotomy is they're just basically allowing like a second area to breathe in. So let's get back to the section that does really concern us, which is definitely talking about your bronchi, right? So this is definitely part of what we call your respiratory passageways, right? And it's what's allowing oxygen to travel where it needs to go. And this is going to be your bronchi. And so in the bronchi, and we'll look at the respiratory passageways here. Bronchi are two primary passageways that branch into each lung and will further divide into bronchioles. I almost wrote, I swear I just about wrote brioche. Bronchial. So it's going to like break down into like smaller and smaller divisions, right? And so there's some really cool stuff inside of your bronchi. You'll see some epithelial tissue and you'll see all kinds of cilia in there. That's designed, you know, this is where you've definitely experienced where there's been like your cilia has been overrun. If you've ever had bronchitis or if you've ever had like a cold where it's like in your lungs real bad, there's all kinds of just like fluid. Usually your cilia, which is all these like little hair-like projections, they're there to like move stuff around in your lungs. But if all that cilia gets covered in crap, you can't diffuse oxygen anymore. And this is what we start to see in things like COPD, right? If we look at like COPD, we'll probably just see a bunch of generic pictures. Actually, no, that's pretty good. What'll happen in COPD is basically these tubes will get covered in junk, right? They'll get covered in mucus, and so you'll see like this inflammation. And what that does is that makes it very difficult for oxygen to be able to travel into these deeper and deeper sections of the lungs. And so it makes it very, 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 very difficult to bring in enough oxygen. And then sometimes it can even result in things like emphysema, which is where, you know, breathing in so hard and trying to drive in massive amounts of oxygen actually breaks down some of the walls of those alveoli, those little popcorn-shaped sacs that I mentioned. And when those get broken down, you have less surface area. And with less surface area, you can diffuse less oxygen. Or if you look at like bronchitis, that is also where basically mucus, oh, there's a good one. Love it when mucus is green and yellow, starts covering these tubes. And so those tubes just, it becomes very, very difficult to drive in oxygen molecules. You know, we're living in a world right now where, you know, we've quarantined everybody off because of this coronavirus, right? And what that does, it causes like fluid and all kinds of other tissues to build up in your lungs. That's what a novel coronavirus is. Like, this is a variation of like the SARS virus, but like what that is like inflammation in your lungs that makes it very difficult to drive in oxygen. And that's what's so, you know, dangerous about this like virus, is the fact that like it prevents you from being able to bring in oxygen. Well, you know, what's the big deal? Couldn't we just like breathe more often? And it doesn't really work that way, right? Because there's only so much diffusion that can take place in your cells, right? And so like, you know, diffusion takes time. It takes a certain amount of pressure. And if those pressure changes and if there's not enough time and you just bring in your next breath, you're not really bringing in more oxygen into your body. And then what ends up happening is like your cells start to suffocate. And so you experience cellular damage. And that's why we're seeing like they don't really know what a lot of the long-term effects of this virus are, but sometimes they're talking about how it creates scar tissue in the lungs, and it's been damaging like the cardiovascular system. It creates like permanent heart damage in some cases. Whether or not that's been coincidence or not, I think is going to play out later on. I think we're going to have more long-term information on this, and maybe we're going to see an autoimmune response that eventually just like comes in and like destroys all that, or, you know, not autoimmune, immune response. Maybe in the end it ends up, you know, finding it's like, oh, those were some pretty rare cases. That's not really how this virus works. But this is one of the reasons why like we do want to avoid this, is because like if you can't keep your cells alive, you can't really keep your body alive, right? Okay, so so your bronchi are these major tubes, right? And then they're going to branch into bronchioles, right? And so no. Back to bullet points. Bronchioles. Oh, hold on. Hey. No, I want you to be numbered. I want you to be bullet points. Bronchioles are small branches from primary bronchi that eventually end in alveoli, right? And then what are alveoli? Are small popcorn-shaped sacs that are covered in capillaries and act as the exchange site for oxygen and carbon dioxide. So your alveoli are what everything ends in, right? So you're going to see your bronchial tree, which will branch into bronchioles and end in your alveoli. Now, you're also going to, it's talking about the diaphragm here as well. And that's very much part of your respiratory pump. And so if we look at that, and there are more parts to this, which we'll see later, but the respiratory pump is your diaphragm. And I'm going to come back to the diaphragm in just a minute, but which is a dome-shaped muscle responsible for contracting and relaxing, which will drive air into and out of the lungs. So I'm going to come back to the diaphragm in just a second, but this is what we're seeing right here, right? You can see all those bronchi, there's your trachea, and it branches into your bronchi, and then those bronchi branch down into your little tiny bronchioles. And your bronchioles end in these little tiny popcorn-shaped sacs, right? Those are your alveoli, and then they're covered, you know, where they are dropping off CO2 or picking up oxygen. we're drawing this in such a way, by the way, guys, that it kind of looks like this is, you get the blue side over here and you get the red side over here. Definitely doesn't work that way. It's just kind of happening all over the place, but there's a good kind of visual representation of like how the dropping off and picking up sort of works. So why do all of this? And I think they mentioned in the video, like, why not just like have a big empty sac that just drives plenty of air in? And well, it's all about surface area. This is a term that's going to come up again when we talk about like our digestive system. So by having like a smaller branch and a smaller branch and a smaller branch, you are enhancing and creating more and more surface area. So I'm going to do the weird thing. I'm going to pull up paint again because normally I draw this and I don't know any better way to explain it. But if you look at, we're going to look at like different examples of surface area here. That's fine. So let's say I've got like a box like this, right? And your job is to paint all of the inside walls here, right? I want every wall, all 6 walls. I want the floor, I want the ceiling, I want all 4 walls covered in paint, okay? You're probably gonna need, let's say, 1 bucket of paint in order to do that, right? But then in the middle of this room, I'm gonna put up like a flat. It's not gonna, you're gonna be able to walk around it on both sides. But it is in the middle of the room and it's in there, so I want it covered in paint too. So I'm just gonna put a little flat, this little thing that's only a couple inches wide, oh God, like that, right? And so you're gonna go in there and now you have to paint this, you have to paint the top, you have to paint both sides, and you have to paint here, but you don't have to paint the bottom anymore because it's already covered, right? Well, that's gonna take more paint because I just increased the surface area of the room, right? That's what's happening in your lungs. Rather than just like your lung being this like empty sac, right? What it's gonna have these bronchi. And so now you've got a little bit more surface area in there, but then that is gonna branch out into little bronchioles, which are gonna branch out into more bronchioles, which are gonna branch out into more bronchioles and more bronchioles. And then eventually they're all gonna get microscopic in size where they get so small and they're going to be covered in those little popcorn-shaped sacs. Those are going to be covered in like capillaries and stuff. And that is where you're going to see all of your surface area, right? Now there's way more room for blood to cover stuff. If it was just covering the walls of your lungs, that would be some surface area. But because it's covering it's covering all of those little sacs that are, each in different areas, and that enhances the surface area and that enhances the surface area. Everything's got to be covered. You've got way, way, way more area to bring in oxygen molecules. Does that make sense? This is definitely like, you learn surface area in math class. So guess what? I'm not great at teaching it, but hopefully that makes sense. We're going to see the same thing show up in our digestive tract, right? Your digestive tract folds like this, right? And that increases the surface area slightly, but then each of the folds has a little fold on it. And that majorly enhances surface area. And then we'll see more little hairs on top of that. Even more surface area. So it's all about having massive amounts of surface area. Like if you were to, it's like when you hear somebody say, take all of your blood vessels out and wrap them around the earth, right? It would wrap around the earth like 3.5 times, right? Like that's how much surface area of like tissue is inside of your body. And a pretty good chunk of that is going to be found in your lungs, covering these alveoli. So now the one other thing we got to mention, right, is the diaphragm, which you can see here, right? The diaphragm is situated underneath the lung. So if your bronchi are providing like a little bit of a stiff framework for, all those blood vessels to kind of travel around those little sacs, your lungs are actually like big empty sacs that are generating pressure changes. And so think of them literally as like a paper sack, right? And let's say you're going to hold the top of that paper sack, right? And so there's the hole is going to be right here, right? And then the sack expands here. If you were to like blow into that sack, right? It would go boom, right? And it would expand like crazy. And then if you were to suck in, it would suck it all in like that, and there'd be very little left in there, right? Well, how did you blow out or inhale into that sack? Well, you created a pressure change within your lungs. When you flattened your diaphragm down like this, that drew your lungs open. And so now there's less pressure in your chest than there was in the sac. And so all of a sudden the sac was like, all the air that was in the sac was like, hey, there's a lot of pressure here and very little pressure over there. And where does stuff like to go? Down its gradient, right? So it's going to move to the area where there's very little pressure. And then when you exhaled, your diaphragm relaxed back into place. And so it pushed your lungs closed, which created an area of high pressure. So all that oxygen wanted to go, woof, I'm out of here. And it moved to an area of low pressure. And that's how breathing actually works. You can even do that with an actual sac. Say you were holding it here and then you just had somebody else, you know, grab a little bit of the sac here and grab it, and they just pulled it like that. That would draw air into that sac because they are generating an area of low pressure. And then if they were to squeeze it, that would create an area of high pressure. And so all the air would go rushing out. That's what you're seeing in space. You know, like in a movie, like in Endgame, where like that dude gets sucked out of the airlock, right? Like that's what's happening in movies like that. Space is nothing but empty space. It's very aptly named. And so because of that, there's no pressure. There's like, it's such a little amount of pressure. But when you're in like a vacuum locked spaceship, there's lots of pressure in there. We don't really feel it. It's normal pressure compared to like what our body's used to, like we're comfy. But if you all of a sudden like open the door and you're in space, all the air is like, I'm out of here. There's so much pressure in here. I'm going over that way. And it just rushes to that area of low pressure. And all of a sudden you go, and that's how you defeat the villain. Your diaphragm is responsible for creating these pressure changes. So your sacs are kind of these big empty, you know, empty space-filled areas. And when your diaphragm is relaxed, it sits in this kind of dome shape, kind of like this. It actually sits in a relaxed position, kind of in this position here, like a little dome. And so that is driving air out of your lungs, right? But when your diaphragm contracts, it actually flattens down like this. It sort of like folds itself down this way. And what that does is it draws your lungs open, creating an area of low pressure. And that's what drives air into your lungs. And that's also why breathing in is actually the active part of breathing. You've got an active and you've got a relaxing part, right? I contract my diaphragm to bring air into my lungs. I relax my diaphragm to drive air out of my lungs. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. I can totally contract and go and like drive air out like crazy. And you can absolutely do that. But that is actually where you're using secondary respiratory muscles. When you exhale very hard, that is actually recruiting extra muscles that are there to generate extra pressure, but they are not part of normal respiration. Normally, breathing in is the active contraction, and breathing out is the act of relaxing. Any questions on any of that so far? How are we following, guys? Cool. Raul, you doing good?
Yeah, doing good, Brett.
All right. First down the lungs, you're killing it. So let's look at the pleurae here. This is kind of a fun one. So your pleurae is this connective tissue that kind of covers your lungs. You've got parietal, visceral, and you've got a little bit of space in between. Am I not getting pictures here? Oh, that is silly. All right, hold on. Now I got to remember how to spell pleurae. So your pleura are basically these linings inside of your lungs. And so that lining there is really nice because there's a little bit of fluid in there that keeps your lungs nice, makes it nice and easy for them to move. And also because this whole environment is kind of wet, it makes it easier for oxygen molecules to travel from point A to point B. Now you're also going to have a little bit of like pleural space, which allows your lungs to further expand here. This is also one of the things that's so dangerous about getting something like pleurisy. Pleurisy is something that often comes along with catching things like bronchitis or the coronavirus. But if we look at like what pleurisy is, let's see, I have no idea how to spell pleurisy. Way off. What's happening is you'll actually get inflammation and extra fluid inside this part of the lungs. And so it causes, it makes it very, very difficult for someone to be able to actually expand their lungs there. And so this is why like these certain types of respiratory disorders are so dangerous, and why we actually don't want too much fluid in our lungs, but we do want some. Fluid inside of our lungs, having a little bit of fluid in there makes it easier for oxygen molecules to transport between and exchange gases, right? But having too much of it, if you get like a bacterial infection and then you get like inflammation of your lungs, that makes it very, 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 very difficult. And this is why it's so important to not smoke or put certain things into your lungs. So like when we're talking about like why smoking is so bad, I mean obviously it's full of like chemicals and free radicals and things like that which can modify our DNA and cause different types of cancers and stuff. And a lot of those free radicals get trapped in our lungs, which is why lung cancer is the most common type associated with smoking. But you can get any type of cancer from being a smoker. It's just that like you're, most likely to do it in your lungs. So why is like smoking so dangerous? Well, what you got to remember about smoking is like it's particles of stuff, right? Like this is why, and I don't want to go like too heavy into like a super long debate about this or anything, but this is why like I'm not a fan of smoking in any form. Vaping, which hasn't been around very long, but I guarantee you is going to be anybody. They can't like say that vaping is like that dangerous right now because it hasn't been around long enough and like we have a responsibility as like a scientific community to make sure that like we know everything before we make broad sweeping statements. But anybody who knows anything about basic biology or basic chemistry or just a little bit of physics understands that like, yeah, it's just as bad as smoking. Like it's still particles of stuff going into an area where stuff gets stuck. Like, but proving that takes time in order to be able to call it proof. And so like they're not allowed to say that like, yeah, it's just as bad as cigarette smoking, but like they're getting there. It's like so frustrating. But like I said, I'm not a fan of smoking in any form or shape, whether that is like cigarettes or like marijuana, like any of that stuff. Now, really quickly, I know some people, whenever they hear that, they get like they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. What about all the anti-cancer benefits of like cannabis and stuff? Hey, you are totally, absolutely right. Human beings, we got some pretty cool cannabis receptors that act really neat in our body, and they've been shown to like have really positive effects on cancer cells and all kinds of really other stuff. There's a lot of really, really positive effects. But smoking broccoli is bad for you. Smoking spinach is bad for you. You are taking particles of stuff and putting it in a wet, sticky environment, and it is not likely to get out of you. I love camping. Campfires are bad for us. I love them to death. They're my favorite thing. But it does not mean that it's good for you. So obviously it's going to come down to like your life choices and stuff. How much do you want to go camping? How much are you going to put yourself at risk? How much do you want to smoke? How much are you going to put yourself at risk? You want a much safer way to get that stuff into your body? Find a way to put it through like a different system, perhaps your digestive system. So anyway, that's kind of like my take on it, because you are taking this wet, sticky environment and you're putting stuff into it. It's not supposed to have anything in there except for gases. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's designed to filter stuff. It's not like our respiratory system doesn't have the capability at all of like handling some stuff, right? But remember, like first law of thermodynamics, which is hugely important to us as personal trainers, stuff can't be created or destroyed. It can just change form from one version to another. So when you take a cigarette and you burn it and smoke it and it goes into your lungs, yeah, you're seeing a lot of it get exhaled. A lot of those particles are coming right back out the other end. But think about how many of them are not. And now they are stuck there. And thermodynamics says that it's stuck there forever because that's how it works. And
that's basically what residue is, right?
Yeah, that's what tar is. Like we describe it as tar, right? And tar is just basically every cigarette you've ever smoked. This is gonna get nasty. Tar in a lung. it's gonna get real bad. But like when you see that, right, that's what it is, all this stuff, you know. It's this wet, sticky stuff that is covering your membranes and it's not going anywhere. And for the most part, you know, like your immune system was like, I don't know what this is, but we're gonna kill it. You know, like your immune system tried real hard to destroy all this stuff, and it did a pretty good job. But again, like the remnants of it has to go somewhere. Thermodynamics, right? We can't get rid of stuff. You can take a burger and turn it into heat energy and exhale the byproducts. You can't take a cigarette and like delete it from your system. It's stuck there. Most of it got exhaled. Like, don't get me wrong, like a lot of it did. And this is actually how, by the way, they discovered thermodynamics. Fun little weird fact. One of the very first tests that they ever did when they were like, you know, trying to prove thermodynamics was they took a cigarette. You know, this is way, 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 way back. And they weighed it on a scale, and then they put like a glass dome over it, and then they lit it on fire. And they measured, like, you know, and the cigarette disappeared. All that was left in there was smoke, and eventually all that disappeared, right? And you couldn't see it anymore because all the smoke settled, right? But it was stuck in an enclosed environment. And guess what? The scale said the same weight. So we know it didn't go anywhere. I can't see it anymore, but it's still there, right? And that's, you know, understanding microscopics. All right, I think I've scared everybody enough about smoking, right? Just imagine my kids someday. They're gonna be bored to death. They're gonna start smoking just because they get so bored. You won't stop talking about thermodynamics. What's that?
I said, hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. So let's look at like the process of overall respiration, right? Again, ventilation is going to happen at the lungs. Exchange of gases is going to happen at the lungs and at the body's tissues, and then we're going to transport those things. So inhalation. So when we're looking at pulmonary ventilation here, and so I guess this is the right section. Yeah, pulmonary ventilation, which is such a big fancy way of saying breathing. So it's going to consist of a couple different phases, right? We are going to see an inhalation phase, right? Which is the active phase of breathing, which includes drawing air into the lungs, right? So you're creating bulk flow, right? That's inhalation. You're going to contract your diaphragm. The diaphragm contracts and draws the lungs open, right? That's inhalation. Then exhalation, which is the passive phase. Exhalation, the passive phase of breathing, in which the diaphragm, the passive phase of breathing, which includes pushing air out of the lungs, right? And so the diaphragm relaxes back into its dome-shaped position and pushes the lungs closed. I don't want to say closed because that's not really accurate. And pushes air out of the lungs. That's way better. I don't want to say that. Pushes air out of the lungs. So that's what we're seeing there, right? Whoops, breaching. No, that should be breathing. Again, we got to remember, contracting down, it seems kind of interesting, but like, yes, the breathing in is the active part and breathing out is the passive part. And so you can see here, part of that respiratory pump, I said there's going to be like way more pieces to that later, includes like your intercostal muscles, which are these little tiny muscles that are situated between your ribs that allows your ribs to expand a little bit and lifts your chest up like this to more effectively allow your lungs to draw open. But that's also why like diaphragmatic breathing is such an important process when it comes to breathing. We want to try to breathe into our stomach. We want to breathe like this rather than this, because you'll notice like when I breathe like this, right, I'm drawing all this extra air in by opening up like a lot of my upper body, which means that my muscles that are also responsible for posture, right, they draw my shoulders back, or they draw my shoulders up, or they move my head like this, right? Now suddenly those muscles are contracting to be part of the breathing process, right? that's not something that I want to have happen, because that will lead to overactive postural muscles. And if those get overactive, they'll keep my other my other breathing muscles from doing their job. This is part of why stress causes like shortness of breath, because when we get stressed, a lot of times we tend to do these shallow little breathing patterns that only come into our chest rather than coming into our diaphragm. So when that happens, you'll see people develop this kind of like, they'll just kind of have this passive posture of like, I'm a stressed person, I'm a, oh God. And so like when that happens, people end up creating more stress hormones. And so it's interesting, it creates like this, what's called like a feedback loop, where like they get stressed, that causes them to breathe wrong, breathing wrong causes stress hormones, and that causes them to be stressed. Big, intense loop of not awesome. Here's the relationship of gas, right? You can see this person's like, blowing up a balloon, and we've all experienced this when like that balloon starts to get to like its full shape, and it becomes like, you gotta breathe way harder, right? You're contracting those extra muscles even harder to drive more air here. But as more and more air molecules go into this small space, the pressure is going to increase. And so you are much more likely to push all that air is much more likely to get pushed out of that balloon the more pressure there is, right? And so that's what we're seeing there. So then we got to look a little bit at our lung volumes here. They kind of skim over this in your regular textbook, but I have seen questions related to this. So your lung volumes. This is something that like makes really good, like, these are 4 pieces of info that make really good flashcards, but honestly, the only ones that are actually that important is going to be your tidal volume. But looking at your different lung volumes, if we're looking at like how much air we can draw in, right? We've got a couple different volumes that we're going to look at. The first one is going to be what's called your tidal volume, which, like I said, is probably the most relevant and important of all of them. But this is the amount of air moved into or out of the lungs during normal, quiet breathing. Okay, so the larger the body that you have, the greater your tidal volume is going to be, because you've got a larger diaphragm and a larger lung structure, right? If you're to measure like how many milliliters of air I can bring into my body versus like a child's, right? My body is much larger, and so it's going to bring in more oxygen. This is also why we start to see like shortness of breath in some people who, in like obese populations, right? One of the reasons why it seems like somebody who is so much larger gets out of breath is because like they have the same capacity in their lungs that they used to have, but now they've got way more cells inside of their body to supply oxygen to. And also there's some other effects like such as like just simple like heaviness weighing down on some of those muscles, making it harder to contract and expand. So both of those are kind of at play there, but like that's what we're seeing in certain populations, right? We're also seeing like a lower VO2 as well. So your tidal volume is the amount of air that you breathe in. Like you guys are all using your tidal volume right now. It's like the tide. It goes in gentle and it goes out gentle. Now we also have our residual volume, which is all the volume that's left. It's the residual, like what's left volume. This is the volume of air that remains in the lungs after a maximal exhalation. So your lungs are not, you're not perfect at drawing all of, or pushing all of the air out of your lungs. There's always going to be just a little bit left. So if you were to go, right, there's a little bit extra, that's your residual volume. Then you've got an inspiratory reserve volume. Right, and that's the additional amount that can be breathed in by force after a normal inhalation. So if I do like a normal breath in, and then I decide to go even more, that's my inspiratory reserve. And then you've already seen the expiratory reserve, but that's the one that I just did a second ago, expiratory reserve volume. and that is the additional amount that can be breathed out by force after a normal exhalation. So your expiratory reserve is like, all right, that's your expiratory reserve. And then if I try to get all the way through my expiratory reserve, the little bit of space that's left, that's that residual volume that we mentioned. Now, a couple other terms that you're going to see are also your vital capacity. Sounds like it's pretty important, and it is. This is the volume of air that can be expelled by the lungs by maximal exhalation after maximal inhalation. So your vital capacity, if you take in the largest breath that you can, and then you do the largest exhale that you can, that's your vital capacity. It's your main, it's like all these volumes kind of put together. And then there's one, I'm totally not going to put this up here, but the functional residual capacity, which is all of the air left after like normal exhalation. So your functional residual capacity is just like your residual volume, except that you're not trying too hard. It's like a normal breathe out and then a little bit extra. So we measure all these things using specific machines, right? Where they're trying to measure and see what someone's lung volumes are, because that can tell them whether or not they might be, the muscles might be contracting, but they're just not bringing in very much volume. Like someone who weighs X number of pounds and someone who is at X whatever age, right? We know what their normal lung volume should be. So if they fall below any of those ranges or above any of those ranges, right, that could be a possible warning sign for certain diseases. So take a look here. You can see like, here's the normal tidal volume. This is how much you're breathing in and breathing out every time. In terms of milliliters, it's about 2,600 to 3,100 milliliters, right? But then you have your inspiratory reserve volume and you have your expiratory reserve volume. So they would say, okay, breathe in as much as you can, breathe out as much as you can, right? And that would be that. And then the residual volume is like the functional residual volume is like all of this area here. It's how much space they're going to estimate is still in the lungs, even if they try to like exhale absolutely as much as they can. So that's what we're seeing there, right? So like if you're exercising and you are literally like, let's say you've just done some serious wind sprints and you are breathing as hard as you can for your life, you are probably using very much your inspiratory and expiratory reserve volumes. And then, exercise is going to exist as some variation in between here. So maybe you have a struggle with like bringing in oxygen and you need to strengthen and get better at breathing. These can all be things that we take into account. The last thing we got to look at here today is we got to look at our gas exchange. Well, today in this PowerPoint, we got to look at our gas exchange. So gas exchange, right? This is where we're talking about how the heck does oxygen decide to move from one direction to another? Some of it is simple diffusion, right? Like we mentioned earlier. Some of it is just like, well, there's not very much oxygen over there, so I'm going to go that way. Like some of it's as simple as that. But there's some other really cool factors at play here as well. So gas exchange requires a pressure gradient, right? Remember, a gradient, nature hates gradients, and so it will move oxygen or other gases down their concentration gradients from areas where there is a lot of pressure to an area where there is very little pressure, right? So nature's gonna move it down their concentration gradient. So during external gas exchange, right, we're seeing oxygen leave the alveoli into the capillaries because there's less pressure in the capillaries than there are in the alveoli. And that's what causes oxygen to want to move in that direction. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide's like, man, there's a ton of CO2 in this blood cell, but there's very little CO2 over there in that alveoli, and so it moves in that direction, right? Whereas the internal exchange is exactly in the opposite direction. So when we see internal exchange, right, we are seeing oxygen leaves the alveoli, right? It leaves the lungs and enters the capillaries because there is less, because it is moving down its concentration gradient. Meanwhile, the exact opposite is happening with CO2, right? CO2 leaves the capillaries and enters the alveoli because it moves down its concentration gradient. So that's actually the same thing. They're both moving down their concentration gradient. When you breathe in, there's a lot of oxygen, right? And very little CO2. And that's why CO2 wants to leave and go to that high oxygen environment. Meanwhile, oxygen wants to go to that high CO2 environment. And the exact same thing is happening. I just wrote internal exchange. That should have been external. I apologize. That external exchange is at the lungs. Internal exchange is the opposite, right? And so what we're seeing there, I cannot type the word exchange apparently, is where oxygen leaves capillaries and enters body tissues because it moves down its concentration gradient. Meanwhile, CO2 leaves body tissues and enters capillaries because it moves down its concentration gradient. A lot of circular thinking when it comes down to this stuff. It's the same process over and over again. But here's what we're seeing, right? The air pressure is very high, so that's going to cause air to move this way and CO2 to move this way. Over here, we see in your body tissues, right? The CO2 pressure is high, so it wants to go this way. We see the air pressure is low, so it wants to go this way. And that's where simple diffusion really takes care of most of our work for us. Now, when it comes to transporting this, right, when it comes to like transporting all of this oxygen to and from, most of it's going to be transported by the specialized protein called hemoglobin, right? So gas transport, if we're looking at it, right, this is going to describe how gases are transported throughout the body using red blood cells. So most of this is going to take place because of a protein called hemoglobin, right? Which is a specialized protein found in red blood cells that contains a molecule of iron which allows oxygen to bind. So here's the thing. This is why it's so important to have iron in our diet, is because iron is actually what allows red blood cells to carry oxygen molecules. It's also what makes your red blood cells red. I know Maggie and Robert, you guys have heard this before, but Raul, if you've ever seen, you know, what happens when you get a little bit of oxygen binding to iron, it turns that iron bright, bright red, right? It starts to rust. This is why actually like the planet Mars is red because there's just like a lot of iron in its soil. And so like, you know, when we bind a molecule of oxygen and a molecule of iron together, it turns a bright red color. And so that is what gives your red blood cells their red hue, is because they all have this little molecule of hemoglobin in them, which oxygen molecules are attracted to. And so you have to have plenty of iron in your diet to ensure that you are delivering oxygen throughout the body. But you could absolutely have too much iron, and then suddenly it actually makes it hard for oxygen to bind as well. So luckily, iron is definitely a normal part of our diet. A lot of times you're going to find it in the form of like a lot of animal proteins, but you're also going to find iron in things like beans and dark leafy greens and stuff like that as well. And so there are plenty of ways to get iron into your diet. So luckily, most of the gas is being transported by hemoglobin. Like, it's going to do most of the heavy lifting. When it comes to carbon dioxide, this is going to be a little bit different. 10% of it is going to be dissolved in the plasma and in the fluid of your red blood cells. So your red blood cells are fluid, just like any other type of tissue, right? And so some of it's going to be dissolved in that tissue. 15% of it is going to bind to hemoglobin, right? So nothing surprising there. But then 75% of it is going to dissolve and be converted into bicarbonate. And bicarbonate is what you're actually seeing here, right? You're seeing, here's an O2 molecule, like 2 oxygen molecules. But if you add a little carbon molecule to those 2 oxygen molecules, you have carbon and O2, that's CO2, right? So most of that is going to be kind of in the form of bicarbonate, which will then be transported so that you can get that crap out of your body. Because if you leave it in there too long, it is going to make you super, super acidic. And this is what actually happens when, like, we talk about kind of trying to regulate things by breathing, right? You are trying to like restore those concentrations. Here's what's kind of funny though. You actually need some CO2 in your body. This sounds kind of weird, but like we're thinking of CO2 as like our waste product, and we're thinking of oxygen as like our ingredient to do stuff, right? Well, CO2 is actually pretty important. If you don't have enough CO2, it actually does make it kind of hard for oxygen to bind to hemoglobin. And so if you've ever hyperventilated before, like let's say, you're panicking a little bit and so you start hyperventilating, what's interesting is that's actually not from a lack of oxygen, even though it feels like it is, right? Like it feels like you can't bring in enough air. You're like trying to breathe more and more and more. What's funny is you're actually driving in plenty of oxygen, but those O2 molecules are having a hard time binding to hemoglobin because there's not a very good pressure gradient. So what you need is more CO2. And then that CO2 creates a gradient where there's a lot of stuff and very little stuff. If you have too much oxygen on both sides, oxygen has no reason to move into your blood cells, right? So what's funny is, how do you fix somebody who's hyperventilating? You have them breathe into like an empty sac. And what that does is they exhale some CO2, and then when they inhale, they re-breathe in their CO2 from before. And then they do it again until the CO2 levels start to climb. And once they get high enough, now oxygen's like, oh man, there's way too much CO2. Great, I'm gonna move in. And so then it moves in and restores those levels back to normal. So that's actually why it's really important to have some CO2 in your body. It creates the gradients that we've been talking about this entire time. It creates the areas of high pressure and low pressure. So how do we regulate all of this, right? How do we actually control how fast we're breathing? Well, all of that is autonomic, right? This is all under the control of your central nervous system, right? Your central nervous system is going to use these specialized receptors that are going to detect changes in your blood chemistry. If it notices that there's a lot of CO2 running through your blood, it's going to make you breathe more, right? And if it notices that there's too little CO2, it'll actually also make you breathe more. If it notices that there's a lot of lactic acid, it's going to make you breathe more, right? And so your nervous system is responsible for contracting your diaphragm. And so it has motor nerves that go from the spinal cord, right? The central part of the nervous system. There are peripheral nerves that will run down, and they will contract your diaphragm there. So you can kind of see there's where that happens, right? The bottom part of actually sort of the middle part of the brain, travels down your nervous system until it causes that, hey, I didn't do that, causes that little dome-shaped muscle to either contract or relax. And if it needs to, it will actually, trigger those secondary respiratory muscles as well. So you've got all kinds of stretch receptors that are responsible for this. You've also got chemoreceptors. Remember those receptors that I mentioned are responsible for sensing chemical changes? If they noticed way too much CO2 or not enough CO2, or if they notice a bunch of lactic acid, right? All of those things are going to trigger response. So you can actually see that happening right here. You can actually see, let's say you experience like pain, or let's say it's like emotional, right? And that causes you to just start breathing more, right? That can cause the part of your brain to trigger fight or flight responses and contract that diaphragm. But the same thing can be true about like your muscle, right? If your muscle starts generating a bunch of like lactic acid because it's doing a bunch of work, that's also going to run past that part of your brain. Here's a weird way to explain it, but this is what always kind of helps me. Basically, your brain is constantly tasting your blood. And if that blood tastes really acidic or really CO2-y, right, it's going to make you breathe more. And it's also going to raise your heart rate simultaneously, and that's where your cardiorespiratory system really works together. So hyperventilation is where you have too much oxygen, not enough CO2, and that increases your blood's pH. If you don't have enough air, that's going to decrease your blood's pH. We want our pH to be around neutral with, well, we want it to be slightly acidic, just a little bit. So just ever so slightly lower than, you know, central. So that's going to be like where we want, because that's how our blood more effectively diffuses things. And that is about it. Do you guys have any questions about that? We lost Raul for a minute. Feeling good, guys? All right, let's go ahead and dive in. Let's look at PowerPoint 7.5, quote unquote. Center this up. PowerPoint 7.5. Chapter 3. Cardiorespiratory system. All right, let's put these things together, shall we? All right, so now we are going to put our cardiovascular system and our respiratory system together. So we're going to see a lot of the similar terms here. We're going to be knocking out some notes real at sort of lightning speed here, but purpose of this PowerPoint is to give us fundamental knowledge explaining our whole cardiorespiratory system. We want to be able to understand the cardiorespiratory system, which will consist of your cardiovascular system and the respiratory system working together. Explain how those relate to human movement. Obviously, if we can't give our body cells fuels, we're never going to be able to move properly. We'll talk a little bit about oxygen testing procedures. Really looking at like VO2 max and things like that, and then relate that to how like proper breathing has an effect on our movement system, right? This is where we are going to talk about like what I mentioned earlier, the posture oxygen connection, right? We need to understand that like those, you know, your posture will affect how well you can breathe. So the cardiorespiratory system, right, is a support system in the body responsible for maintaining the human how do I want to say this? Actually, hold on. Oh, that's what it is. I was like, I know the definitions on this slide. Whoops. It's a support system in the body responsible for providing tissues of the human movement system with oxygen, nutrients, protective agents, and a means to remove waste products. So this is responsible, proteases, nice. This is responsible for bringing in that oxygen and then delivering it, right? So it consists of the cardiovascular system, right? And the respiratory system. So when we look at this, if we're drawing like a little flow chart, right, we got to look at the cardiovascular system first. The cardiovascular system, that is going to be the heart, blood, and blood vessels. right? Just like we said yesterday. And so the heart is primarily this big muscular pump that contracts to push blood throughout the body, right? It's going to be the tissue that makes it up is going to be that cardiac tissue. And like we said before, our heart is located in the mediastinum, right? You can see here's your SA node, which sort of controls that heart's contraction rhythm. The AV node, which sort of delays it for a second, and then all of those fibers that it expands to kind of create contraction throughout the whole heart, right? So if we're looking at it, the heart is a muscular pump that contracts to push blood throughout the body, and its main job is to have all these really cool cardiac fibers that contract. It is comprised of cardiac fibers that rhythmically contract to generate and maintain pressure, blood pressure in particular, right? The heart has a built-in internal rhythm of about 70 to 80 beats per minute. So the average resting heart rate that we're seeing is about 70 to 80 beats per minute, about 70 for most males, about 75 for most females. And we're just seeing like a slight difference there because of the difference in like the size of blood vessels and in the size of hearts. So again, like cardiac output will be very comparable for like your body size, but we do tend to see like the larger the heart because of a larger left ventricle, we see like a slower heart rate. Remember, the left ventricle is responsible for pumping blood throughout the body. And so that's one of the differences we're going to see in not our next class, but the one after this, when we get to the program design class, when we start talking about the differences between adults and youths. One of the things is like kids are going to have a naturally much higher heart rate because their left ventricle is much smaller. So it has to pump more often to make up for the fact that it doesn't have a very large stroke volume. So that's what we're seeing there. So we've got specialized structures within the heart, right, that allow that rhythm to contract. So these rhythms, so we have specialized structures that generate and control this internal rhythm is known as the heart's conduction system. Right, that's what we're going to call this. We're going to call it the heart's conduction system. That conduction system is going to consist of our sinoatrial node. Right, that's the SA node, which is the pacemaker of the heart that determines the heart's rhythm. Right. We're also going to see some other ones like your internodal pathways, which travel from. You're going to see your AV node, which delays the signal before it gets to your ventricles. That way, the top of your heart can contract first, and then by the time your top of your heart relaxes, you are contracting the bottom of your heart, and so that creates a pressure change. And so now fluid's going to move from direction to direction, right? And then from that AV node, it's going to travel throughout your bundle of His and all of your Purkinje fibers, which are going to contract all of that heart muscle. But honestly, guys, the big one you need to know is the sinoatrial node. So we're going to leave it like that. Now, we've got all of our different chambers of the heart. So we've got heart chambers here. Right, we've got atriums, which are in charge of gathering blood, and ventricles, which are going to pump blood away. So atria are chambers that gather blood as it returns to the heart, right? And then we've got ventricles, which are chambers that pump blood away from the heart. So both of your atria gather blood, both of your ventricles pump blood. It just determines like what section that they are in. So the right atrium is in charge of gathers blood that is low in oxygen, and the left atrium gathers blood that is high in oxygen. And the exact same is true in the other direction. Your ventricles, you got your right ventricle, right, which pushes low oxygen blood to the lungs, and the left ventricle, which is arguably the most important, pushes high oxygen blood throughout the body. Okay, so that's what we're seeing there. Your low oxygen blood's got to get to the lungs so that it can become high oxygen blood. So we've seen our heart chambers again. And then the last thing about the heart that's also really, really important is understanding like how we measure the function of the heart. So measuring the function of the heart, this is where we come back to that cardiac output, right? So each contraction is going to push blood throughout the body. The amount of blood that's pushed per contraction is referred to as your stroke volume. We want that stroke volume to be as high as possible. I want to push so much blood throughout my body with as few beats as possible, right? And then we have your heart rate, which is how often your heart is actually beating, right? Stroke volume is the volume of blood pushed throughout the body per beat. And then your heart rate is the number of times the heart contracts per minute, right? So all of those things come together to make up what is called your cardiac output, okay? So your cardiac output is the overall performance of the heart, consisting of how much blood is pumped per minute. And that formula, again, is going to be cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate, okay? So I know we've already seen all this, but that's why we're kind of moving through this a little quick. So that is the overall performance there. Now, we're gonna measure our heart rate using typically our radial pulse. NASM is going to recommend, NASM recommends measuring heart rate using the radial pulse, right? Which is going to be located, actually, that's not how I want to write it. So you're going to locate the artery by feeling for a pulse with the index and middle finger, middle finger applying pressure in line with the thumb just above the wrist on the left hand. So, so when you're looking at it, right, you are going to measure on your client's left arm, and you are going to take your index finger and middle finger and place two fingers in line with the thumb, with their thumb and index finger on that side right there, just above the wrist, right? So just above where they can bend. And you should be able to feel their radial pulse. You can always do the carotid pulse as well, but NASM doesn't recommend it for a couple different reasons. Number one, it can be uncomfortable to be like, give me your neck. And number two, you don't want to ever push too hard and close off someone's windpipe or like blood to the head, because they can get lightheaded. I've never once seen that happen, but it's theoretical. You know, theoretically it can happen. So you are going to measure for 6 seconds and add a 0. Okay, so that's going to give you the full 60 seconds. So if you're counting and it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you're gonna measure for 8 seconds. Like you're adding a 0 onto that, and it's like your pulse is currently 80 beats per minute, which is exactly, oh my God, exactly what mine is at right now. I was like, I'm standing up. It should be somewhere around there. So blood, the next part of your blood, next part of your cardiovascular system. Where am I at? Nope, one more. right? Blood is going to acts as a medium to deliver and collect essential products to and from the body's tissues. So blood is how we're actually transporting all this stuff around. So it is going to be responsible for transports oxygen, hormones, nutrients, and waste products throughout the body, right? That's a lot of stuff, right? And that's why like you got to remember that your blood is like a series of cells, and there's also some other fluids in there as well. In fact, if we look at blood components, you can see this is actually what that's going to look like here. You can see 55% of it is plasma. That's mostly made up of things like water. There's some ions in there, like hydrogen or maybe some oxygen. There's proteins in there. Certain nutrients are running through there. You've got lactic acid and CO2 in there, oxygen. That's your plasma, right? So if you were to take like blood and put it into a centrifuge, put it in like the gravitron into a centrifuge, you're going to see it separate into these materials. It'll kind of look like this. The heaviest stuff moves to the bottom. This is your red blood cells, right? Most of your blood is, well, not most of your blood, but some of your blood is red blood cells. The middle section is where you're going to find your platelets and white blood cells. This is going to be responsible for your immune system, right? This is going to help you scab things over if you need to clot your blood, or it's going to have like all kinds of cool things in there like neutrophils and basophils and all these other type of white blood cells that are going to come by and eat any foreign invaders. And so like there's what we're seeing, right? We've got our red blood cells here, we got our platelets and white blood cells, and we've got our plasma. So blood is definitely not just red blood cells, which is sometimes a common mistake that we sometimes make when we think of our blood. These are responsible for carrying those nutrients, but if you whip them around enough, you can actually separate them out of there. So it's going to transport all those different things. It's responsible for regulating your pH. It protects you from injury by clotting, and it has all kinds of immune cells there to eat foreign invaders. I will mention just one more time. I know I already mentioned it, and we literally already have it in our notes, but I'm just going to put it up here as well. Red blood cells are specialized cells that contain a protein called hemoglobin, which binds to oxygen to allow for the transportation of gases, right? Hemoglobin, that very, very important protein there that contains a molecule of iron and allows that to happen. And then lastly, we got our blood vessels, right? Blood vessels, which are a closed circuit of hollow tubes that allow blood to be transported to and from various parts of the body and back to the heart, right? So of your blood vessels, you are going to have arteries, which carry blood away from the heart. You're going to have capillaries, which form beds to act as the exchange site for materials, and veins, which carry blood back to the heart. Whew. Okay, so those are sort of our three main types there. I know venules and arterioles aren't mentioned there, but we kind of moved past those pretty quick. So that is your blood vessels in a nutshell. So you can definitely see this is a very watered down version of all the stuff we've talked about, right? This is kind of the broad strokes. NASM totally wants you to know that normal blood pressure is 120/80. They'll probably bring it up, but they don't necessarily bring it up as part of like your science questions. They bring it up as part of your like assessment questions, which is a big part of your test as well. But we got to understand what the vessels are before we can understand pressure. So don't just go ahead and like only pay attention to this section, like definitely review your other notes as well. But remember, like your test is just a customized version. It's just pulling X number of questions from each section, right? Like 20% of your questions are program design questions. 18% of your questions are from science plus nutrition. So 18 of 100, is it 18%? It might even be 12%. But that's where they're pulling them from. So blood pressure might not be part of the blood vessel conversation until later, when it gets to talking about special populations, for instance. So, but we still need to know all of them. Okay, and then a little bit more on respiratory stuff where we start to put them together, right? So now let's look at the respiratory system. Like I said earlier, you're going to see the respiratory pump and the respiratory passageways here. So the respiratory system, right, is okay, yeah, here we go. They did it again. They put the definition at the bottom. I was like, what the heck? Is a system that works intimately with the cardiovascular system by providing a means by which to collect oxygen from the environment and transport it to the bloodstream. Okay, so this is allowing that proper cellular functioning, right? Allows for proper cellular functioning, which is Memler's definition that we saw earlier. It is going to consist of two primary sections, right? The collection and transportation of oxygen is available because of your pump and your passageways. So let's look at the pump first, right? So your respiratory pump is going to be located in the thoracic cavity. It provides the framework and flexibility to allow for the expansion and compression needed for ventilation to occur, right? So this is a very flexible area, right? So this is going to be where you see the actual, like, you know, this is the outer sacs that make up your lungs. It's your diaphragm, it's things like that. So it's divided into two phases, right? So it's going to consist of bones. It consists of bones such as the sternum, ribs, and vertebrae, right? So all of that's actually part of your lungs. Kind of interesting. You wouldn't think that, like, your ribs play a huge part in, like, breathing, but they do. They open up and they expand. In fact, if you've ever had like a side stitch where you've been doing your cardio and you're just like, oh God, yeah, it starts cramping up and you're doing that thing where you're like, just let go. That cramping is actually because the muscles in between your ribs are just exhausted. They're just like, we don't do this cardio crap. What are you doing? Like, sit down, right? And so those muscles have been contracting and expanding. Chances are, if you have been suffering from like a side stitch pretty continuously, you're probably much more of like a chest breather. And one of the best ways to like learn how to deal with that is learn how to be more of a diaphragmatic breather. Try to send your breath into your stomach. I always tell my clients, try to breathe into your legs. No, you don't have lungs in your legs, but try to send it as low as you can. It's a pretty good way to turn on the right muscles. And it's also going to consist of muscles, right? It will also consist of muscles such as the diaphragm, external and internal intercostals, which are the muscles between your ribs, your scalenes, sternocleidomastoid. You don't have the word scalenes? No way. I can't even believe that. It has sternocleidomastoid, but it doesn't have scalenes. And pec minor and abdominals. So your abdominals do play like a small role here, but you'll notice we've got the inspiration part and the expiration part. Remember, inspiration is the active phase, expiration is passive. You don't even need to contract these muscles to actually get air out of your body. But we often do because we tend to breathe wrong. We tend to get into these bad habits and overactivate certain muscles. And then those overactive muscles keep our underactive muscles from being able to do our job, which leads to inadequate breathing patterns, right? We end up breathing out too hard and breathing in too gentle because we develop this overactive, underactive situation. Definitely not something we want to have happen. We don't want the sternocleidomastoid, the pec minor, the scalenes, and the external intercostals are okay. We don't want these three muscles doing too much work during breathing, but they often do, right? Your scalenes, they do a little bit of this and a little rotational movement, right? Your sternocleidomastoid does this forward head posture stuff. Your pec minor does protraction of your shoulder. So if you end up like this, which we often do because we're on computers and cell phones and things like that all day, you can understand how that makes it very difficult to drive air into our lungs the way that we're supposed to. So that's the respiratory pump. It's all the stuff that drives oxygen into or out of our lungs. The respiratory passageways are all the tubes. Right, and these are the passageways that funnel air into and out of the lungs for proper utilization. So you got two sections here. You've got the conduction passageway and then the actual respiratory passageways. Why they name one of them respiratory passageways, I don't know, just to confuse people who are studying this the first time. But the conduction passageways are basically all of the stuff right before it actually gets to your lungs. So this is the conduction section here. It's right as this branches. But then once it becomes all the really, really, really tiny branches, those are the small respiratory passageways, right? Those are your alveoli and your alveolar sacs, right? So we're gonna see, I'm gonna say nasal and oral cavities, trachea, pulmonary, oops, hold on. Consists of, there we go, your pulmonary bronchi. And you're also going to see, it also consists of the alveoli and alveolar sacs, right? So the alveoli is kind of the big main structure, and the alveolar sacs are the little popcorn shapes, but you can honestly just say alveoli. So those are the pumps and those are the passageways, which is a little bit different than how we broke it down earlier, because this is very much related to like understanding the anatomy as it relates to exercise, right? This is where we're starting to see, oh, I can mess up my breathing with bad posture, right? Which isn't directly related to like an anatomy thing, but it does affect your physiology. You can't do this as effectively if you screw up that whole system. And again, like I've said this a million times, but like what's a trainer's job? We look at what you're too good at and we look at what you struggle with and we do the opposite. I'm the stuff that you're too good at. It's not that I make you worse at it, but I get that stuff to relax. The stuff that you're not so good at, I'm going to strengthen it, right? And so we know that that's directly related to our posture, which is also directly related to how we can breathe. You ever see somebody who's like barrel chested? You'll see this, where some people will have this kind of interesting posture as they get older. And you can see where they expand all these like muscles around like this section here, right? And that is a lot of overactive secondary muscles. They experience like hypertrophy, which makes it very difficult for them to breathe later on in life. And it leads to things like COPD. In fact, and COPD then kind of further, feeds into this as well. Yeah, there's a really, that's intense. So a lot of times, like, they used to be like a sign of masculinity. You guys used to walk around like this all the time. They had like invisible lats that stuck out from their body. But really, that's a sign of dysfunctional breathing. Okay, let's take a look at these two systems coming together, right? So the cardiovascular system cardiorespiratory system at work. So the cardiorespiratory system at work. So if you were to summarize everything that we've talked about today down to a couple of simple concepts, it is this. The respiratory system provides a means by which to gather oxygen from the environment and transfer it to the body, and the cardiovascular system provides a means by which to transport that oxygen to the tissues of the body. And that is honestly the simplest version of exactly how that works. Now, we do have a way of measuring this. We do have a way of measuring this in the form of what we call metabolic equivalence, or METs, M-E-T. So oxygen consumption will be at an average rate of about 3.5 milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. This is known as 1 metabolic equivalent, or MET. Okay, so a metabolic equivalent, so you're consuming about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per minute when you are at rest. So a MET measures oxygen consumption during rest. Okay, so that's about that 3.5 milliliters that we're talking about, right? So if you get on a machine and you punch in your body weight and height and all this stuff, actually just your body weight, what it'll do is it'll say, hey, you're working out at 6 METs per minute, right? And so if we look at like METs and exercise, right? If we take a look here, I just want a chart. Give me a chart. Yes. This is looking at like your METs per hour, right? So if you're walking, you're burning about twice as many calories. You're consuming about twice as much oxygen. If you're bicycling at 10 to 16 miles per hour, check it out. About 10 to 16 METs per hour. This is why I've said this before. A lot of times you're not going to use METs. Honestly, like the only people who really measure METs often cyclists. It's really huge in like the pro cycling world because they want to know exactly how many calories you're burning, so they know exactly how much fuel to give you so that you can continue on this 10,000-mile bike ride. You know, like I'm not making, well, I am kind of making fun of bicycling a little bit because I'm a runner. But yeah, you can see like basically it's the number of calories that you're burning per hour compared to how many you would be. I like using this by being like, hey, going out for a walk, you're burning about 2 METs per hour. You just burn twice as many calories as you would have. That's a great way to think about it. You're cleaning your house, you're burning 3 times as many calories as you would be if you were sitting on the couch doing nothing right now. So I love to like pull up a MET on a treadmill temporarily and be, check it out. You're burning 4.5 times. You would have to watch 4.5 times more TV to burn as many calories as you just did in 30 minutes. I think that's kind of a fun motivating factor. But how often do we use it to like measure intensity? Not very often, if I'm being honest. It's one of those things that they put in there. And like, you know, I've been teaching this for a few years now. And I can't think of very many times that I've like measured METs with my clients in order to like determine how many calories to give them. But it can provide a little bit of information about your client. So it's kind of nice. All right. Last little thing we're going to look at is dysfunctional breathing. So dysfunctional breathing. When it comes to your cardiorespiratory system, when it is working, dysfunction in the cardiorespiratory system can directly impact the components of the human movement system and lead to further dysfunction. So what they're saying by that, right, is that improper posture or improper breathing patterns can affect posture, and posture can affect breathing patterns, right? So this goes in both directions. Alterations in your breathing patterns are a really good example of the overactive, underactive muscle dynamic that is so important to us as personal trainers. So what we see is that during shallow breathing patterns, secondary respiratory muscles, you know, things like the abdominals, things like the sternocleidomastoid, etc., start, oops, hold on, are used predominantly, leading to dysfunctional breathing. Right? So when we start using those secondary respiratory muscles, we start breathing the wrong way. And that, because they also play a role in posture and things like that, it can this can lead to shortness of breath and can lead to headaches and nausea. So what's interesting about this is, like, by not breathing it, bringing in the proper amounts of like oxygen, it can lead to these tension headaches, which are really, really, really painful. And then because you're in pain, your autonomic nervous system activates the fight or flight response, which makes you further breathe shallow. Again, 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 big self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Feedback loop. So we want to make sure that we're helping our clients stretch these muscles out, maybe through stretching out the scalenes and the upper trapezius like so, the levator scapulae, the sternocleidomastoid, right? The pectoralis minor. This is not a great way, by the way. I just don't have a better wall. This way. But like all of those are really good examples of things that can release all of that. And then practicing proper diaphragmatic breathing and strengthening the muscles that bring you back into normal posture, such as like your deep cervical flexors, right? All those things can lead to proper breathing patterns in the end, which can enhance your client's overall quality of life. So summarizing 2 PowerPoints in one day, respiratory system is going to gather oxygen from the environment through your nose and mouth and deliver it to the tissues throughout your body, thanks to your cardiovascular system, which is actually going to pump those materials throughout the body. So as our cells use oxygen, they're going to produce carbon dioxide, which is then going to be transported back to the heart, and then that will get it back to the lungs so that it can be exhaled and removed from the body. And the collection of all of this is possible thanks to your respiratory pump, which is driving pressure changes, and your respiratory passageways, which are allowing oxygen to travel where they need to go. If there is dysfunction in one system, it can lead to dysfunction in the other system. And that is everything. Whew! How you guys feeling? That was a lot. I got pretty monotone today. I was like trying to type really fast. What did we do? 8 pages of notes. Yeah. Ooh, hold on. What did I just hit? Screen sharing is paused. Didn't know that was a button. There we go. Do you guys have any questions?
No. Very good job.
Thank you.
I do have one question, Brad. I remember you mentioned this before, but you said that people are wrong when they say it's hard for me to breathe. Well, not that they're wrong, but they're just not fully correct when you say that it's hard for them to breathe with a mask on.
Oh, yeah. So, all right. So here's the thing. It may be different. You may have to contract muscles a little harder because maybe it is difficult to draw gas into your lungs. But the fact that they feel like they're out of breath or short of breath is a misconception. Like, yes, you're breathing harder. Like, you know, your muscles have to contract harder. Like, it's more difficult because it's like breathing through like a wet cloth, you know, like it's just challenging. But the gas that's still getting through there at this level is the same amount of gas, right? Like, so the concentration of like, like I said, most of air is nitrogen, right? Let's actually, I'll pull up a picture of air here. Concentration of gases in atmosphere. So here's what air actually is. That's not right. That is a picture of greenhouse gases. I was like, there is not that much ozone. All right, so here's your actual air, right? So some of it's water vapor, humidity. Most of it's nitrogen. A good chunk of it is oxygen. And then you're gonna see things like argon, neon, carbon dioxide, all these other gases that go in. But your lungs are designed to filter that out. Your lungs are like, I don't need nitrogen, I just need the oxygen. So this concentration is the same, right? Now, when you're at sea level, the amount of like these molecules that are in the space that you're bringing in is really high. When you're at high elevation, the amount of molecules that you're bringing in is actually very low. That's why you do feel out of breath if you're at high elevation. But wearing a mask doesn't affect the concentrations because you're still at sea level or you're still at the whatever elevation you're at. So yeah, it may be that you need to contract your muscles more to draw in the same amount of gas, but the amount of air that you're bringing in is the same. That's why those elevation masks that you'll see people buy, where it has like the valve on it and you can close it down and it makes it hard for you to breathe in. It does make it hard for you to breathe in, but those elevation training masks do not make your body better at like breathing. There's some mental toughness there. And so like you might get better at handling discomfort. So I'm not saying they're useless, but when you're at high elevation, because there's actually less oxygen in the atmosphere, and that's the thing, like let's see that at Everest. I'm never gonna be able to find the picture I actually need. I don't know how to Google what I want. Air composition, sea level versus high elevation. Kind of. Okay, I was just open for a pie chart, but here's what we see. So higher altitude, less oxygen. Same concentration, right? Low altitude, way more red molecules, way more oxygen, right? So when you are in an atmosphere like this, like if you're at Everest, your body will go, holy crap, there are no oxygen molecules up here, and it'll make more hemoglobin in response. At sea level, that doesn't have to happen because there's plenty of oxygen. Your body doesn't need to produce as much hemoglobin. So when people wear those masks to make more hemoglobin, it doesn't work because the pressure is the same. Alternatively, me doing this makes it harder for me to like drive air into my lungs. Doesn't mean the concentration's changed at all. So sure, bringing air, I'll admit, like wearing a mask makes it harder to bring air in. It does not make it harder for you to breathe because breathing is driving oxygen. Does that make sense? This is like a technicality of like, vocabulary, but it is an important one because it has, public health concerns.
Yeah, it's because I was trying to explain it to somebody last time and I was like, oh, what was Brad saying? I can't remember.
Yeah. Hey man, I've tried to explain to my mom my mom does have lung problems. Like she's got really bad COPD because she was a smoker for years. And so like she has a really hard time with the mask on. And I'm always trying to be like, Mom, it's mental. And I know you have no reason to believe me because you changed my diapers, but trust me on this. Like you spent, you helped me go to a very expensive school to explain this to you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording. I'll see all you all tomorrow.